On California highways, ICE launching the operation following multiple deadly crashes involving commercial trucks driven by unauthorized immigrants.
At 5:12 a.m., before sunrise on a quiet California highway, federal patrol vehicles moved with calm precision, pulling commercial trucks to the shoulder one by one without sirens, without chaos, and without warning, signaling that this was no ordinary traffic stop, but the opening move of a much larger federal operation already underway. Agents approached cabs quickly. Documents were checked on the roadside. Commercial driver licenses were scanned against federal databases. And within minutes, routine questions turned into firm commands as drivers were ordered out, restrained, engines shut down, and cargo that had been freely moving across state lines suddenly fell under federal control. According to major U.S. outlets like Reuters and the Associated Press, this early morning sweep marked the first visible phase of Operation Highway Sentinel, a nationwide enforcement campaign launched after investigators linked multiple deadly interstate crashes to commercial drivers who were never legally authorized to be behind the wheel. What made this operation different was not the arrests themselves, but where they happened, not at borders, warehouses, or workplaces, but directly on America's highways, the arteries of trade where a single mistake can cost lives far beyond one city or state. Federal officials later confirmed that more than 100 drivers were taken into custody in California alone, with similar actions unfolding quietly across other states, revealing a deliberate shift in enforcement strategy. Instead of public announcements or long investigations, federal agencies went straight to the road, identifying key freight corridors, tracking trucks in motion, observing behavior, verifying plates, and selecting targets with precision before smoothly guiding them to the shoulder. Each stop was fast and controlled. Licenses verified in real time, legal status confirmed on the spot, and arrests made immediately when violations were found, while traffic continued flowing around them. There were no raids, no forced doors, and no drawn-out cases, just swift decisions made in minutes. Officials emphasized that speed was critical, noting that every hour an unauthorized driver stays on the road is another hour of potential danger, especially after investigators tied several fatal crashes to improperly issued licenses. By turning highways into active enforcement zones, federal authorities removed the ability to hide, reroute, or delay, striking directly at an industry that depends entirely on constant movement. By the time the sun rose fully over California, long lines of trucks were still moving through familiar routes, unaware that patterns, not speed, were being watched, and that a single pull to the shoulder could instantly transform a routine freight run into a federal case. What began before dawn made one thing clear: America's highways are no longer neutral ground, and Operation Highway Sentinel signals a new era where federal authority applies pressure not with raids or announcements, but 1 mile of asphalt at a time. Checks against federal systems happened in real time, and while the process was fast and professional, the atmosphere on the roadside was heavy and tense, because every driver understood this was not a warning and not a routine inspection, but a moment that could end their livelihood in minutes. That uncertainty hung in the air longer than the flashing lights themselves. According to Reuters and the Associated Press, these stops added up quickly. Within days, more than 100 commercial truck drivers were taken into custody across California, not in one place or at one time, but scattered across multiple highways and different hours of the day, creating a powerful message that nowhere on the road was off limits. Drivers came from many different countries, a detail later confirmed by federal officials to show how widespread and deeply rooted the issue had become inside the logistics system. What made the scene striking was not what happened, but what didn't. There were no chases, no barricades, no dramatic confrontations. Yet the psychological pressure was unmistakable, because a truck driver cannot simply walk away from a vehicle that represents both income and legal exposure. Once stopped, the outcome was decided quickly. Some drivers were cleared and sent back onto the highway, while others were escorted away in handcuffs, leaving their trucks sitting under federal control. Observers noted how the operation transformed the normal rhythm of highway traffic into a series of deliberate pauses, truck after truck slowing, pulling over, and waiting as federal authority played out in full public view. National coverage made clear this visibility was intentional. Enforcement was meant to be seen, not hidden behind warehouse doors or paperwork. For passing motorists, the image was unsettling. Rows of trucks on the shoulder, patrol vehicles positioned behind them, agents moving with purpose, sending a message without words that America's highways were no longer neutral ground. Federal officials later explained that California was chosen first because of its central role in interstate freight. Trucks that begin there rarely stay there, instead crossing multiple states and interacting with thousands of other vehicles, turning every roadside decision into a national safety judgment made in minutes. As the operation continued, patterns emerged. Drivers warned each other, traffic slowed near enforcement zones, and uncertainty itself became part of the strategy, discouraging risk without any public announcement. By the end of this phase, the message was clear: more than 100 drivers removed, countless inspections completed, and a system placed under public scrutiny. But California was only the beginning. As pressure built on the West Coast, federal teams were already moving east, and soon identical scenes appeared in Indiana, New York, and Oklahoma, proving this was no local response, but a synchronized national campaign. In Indiana, along major freight corridors, the same pattern repeated again and again, and according to Reuters and the Associated Press, a parallel effort known as Operation Midway Blitz resulted in more than 200 arrests, many involving commercial drivers, with hundreds of vehicles inspected in short, precise windows before enforcement shifted locations. The repetition was deliberate, the method refined. Highways chosen for visibility, trucks targeted because they cannot avoid fixed routes without disrupting supply chains, inspections fast and decisive, arrests immediate when authorization failed, and releases just as quick when documents checked out. New York saw the same approach on busy interstates feeding major logistics hubs, while Oklahoma confirmed that enforcement had moved deep into the interior of the country, where uninterrupted transport is critical. What stood out most was the uniformity. Different states, different terrain, but nearly identical enforcement, showing a level of national planning that signaled a lasting shift. America's highways were no longer just paths of movement and trade, but active enforcement zones, where compliance is tested mile by mile and consequences follow in minutes. Federal officials later made it clear that this level of uniformity was intentional and carefully planned, because what was unfolding on the highways looked less like routine traffic enforcement and more like national security operations. According to the Associated Press, investigators had identified a shared risk across multiple states: improperly authorized drivers operating massive commercial vehicles capable of causing mass casualty disasters. Addressing that threat required speed, scale, and consistency. Instead of designing separate strategies for each state, federal agencies applied one single enforcement model everywhere, ensuring predictable outcomes and efficient use of resources. The psychological impact was immediate. Word spread fast among drivers. Routes that were once considered safe began to feel uncertain, and every checkpoint, no matter the state, raised the same silent question: will this be my stop? That uncertainty was not accidental. It was part of the strategy, discouraging noncompliance even when enforcement units were no longer visible. By the time similar actions in Indiana, New York, and Oklahoma reached national headlines, the pattern was impossible to ignore. This was not a collection of disconnected sweeps meant for attention. It was a system being tested, refined, and scaled in real time, with each state adding data, each arrest strengthening the model, and each inspection sharpening the process. What emerged was a new understanding of enforcement itself. Highways were no longer just transit corridors, but operational zones where federal authority could act quickly, visibly, and repeatedly. As the campaign expanded, one conclusion became unavoidable. Operation Highway Sentinel was not slowing down. It was settling into a national rhythm. That led many to ask a key question: why trucks? Why focus so intensely on commercial vehicles instead of warehouses, workplaces, or border crossings? The answer sits at the core of how America functions. A commercial driver license is not just permission to drive. It unlocks access. One CDL allows a driver to cross state lines freely while moving tens of thousands of pounds of cargo through ports, fuel depots, bridges, tunnels, and crowded urban highways. When everything goes right, no one notices. When something goes wrong, the consequences are immediate and irreversible. Federal officials understood this from the beginning. This was never framed as a paperwork issue. It was about risk. A fully loaded tractor trailer weighs many times more than a passenger car and takes far longer to stop. One mistake, one missed sign, or one misunderstood instruction can turn an ordinary commute into a deadly event. That is why, as reported by Reuters and the Associated Press, investigators began linking multiple fatal crashes across different states to drivers who were never legally authorized to operate commercial trucks. The danger multiplies because the system is interconnected. A CDL issued in one state does not stay there. A driver licensed on the West Coast can be hauling freight through the Midwest days later and passing through the Southeast by the weekend. When oversight fails at the starting point, the risk spreads instantly nationwide. Federal authorities saw this not as isolated failures, but as a chain reaction, and chains are broken at critical points, not ignored. One case repeatedly cited in national reporting showed how a license approved in one state led to a fatal crash hundreds of miles away, with no second chance and no warning. That moment became a turning point. Instead of reacting after tragedy, authorities chose to intervene earlier, while trucks were still moving. This logic explains Operation Highway Sentinel. Trucks cannot hide. They follow fixed routes, operate on schedules, and depend on constant motion to survive economically. Stopping a truck does not require months of surveillance or dramatic raids. Only timing, coordination, and a clear legal threshold. Once stopped, the entire risk equation changes instantly. Visibility mattered too. A warehouse raid disappears behind closed doors, but a roadside stop does not. Trucks pulled over on major highways send a message that travels far beyond the driver involved. Other drivers slow down. Companies take notice. States feel pressure. According to the Associated Press, officials believed this visibility was essential to restoring public confidence after a series of deadly crashes. The approach also avoided long investigations that often stall or fail. There was no need to prove intent or build complex cases. The question was simple and immediate. Is this driver legally authorized and properly qualified to be in control of this vehicle right now? If the answer was no, enforcement followed on the spot. That is why federal officials framed Operation Highway Sentinel not just as immigration enforcement, but as a national safety mission. Every truck removed from the road represented not only a violation addressed, but a potential disaster prevented. By focusing on trucks, the federal government chose the exact point where policy meets physics, where steel, speed, and mass leave no room for error. And that reality shaped every decision in the operation. Operation Highway Sentinel explains why enforcement unfolded where it did, not behind closed doors, not in offices or warehouses, but out in the open on the highways that connect the entire country. And by the time the arrests were making national headlines, it became clear that roadside enforcement was only half of the strategy. Federal authorities were not satisfied with simply removing drivers from a road. They wanted leverage, and leverage meant money. According to reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, Washington quickly escalated the operation by tying compliance to federal funding, instantly raising the stakes and turning traffic enforcement into a direct power struggle between the federal government and the states. States accused of issuing commercial driver licenses without meeting federal standards were warned that transportation funding could be withheld, a move with immediate real-world consequences. Road repairs delayed, infrastructure projects paused, and state budgets suddenly under strain. The message was unmistakable. Cooperation was no longer optional. California was among the first to feel the pressure, with federal officials announcing that tens of millions of dollars in transportation funding were being withheld due to failures in CDL oversight, pushing the operation beyond the shoulder of the highway and straight into state agencies and governors' offices. Colorado soon followed, after a federal audit reportedly found that a significant number of commercial licenses issued to immigrants did not meet legal requirements, triggering warnings that further funding cuts were possible. At this stage, the issue was no longer about individual drivers. It was about forcing entire systems to change. States that resisted faced escalating consequences, launching internal reviews, rechecking databases, and preparing notices for drivers whose licenses were now under scrutiny. In several cases, states announced plans to revoke or suspend improperly issued CDLs, actions that carried real economic impact, sidelining drivers, disrupting companies, and rippling through local economies. What made this phase especially significant was its speed. Unlike traditional federal-state disputes that drag on through courts and regulations, this process moved fast. Arrests created urgency, financial penalties created momentum, and together they formed a pressure loop that left little room for delay. Federal officials understood that arrests alone could be absorbed, but budget pressure could not. Infrastructure funding touches every voter, every district, and every elected official, turning enforcement into a political problem that demanded immediate attention. States tried to navigate carefully, push back too hard and risk losing funds, comply too quickly and risk admitting fault, while some challenged the federal narrative even as the financial threat loomed overhead. For the public, the shift was subtle but profound. What began as traffic stops now influenced how states issue licenses, train officials, and enforce compliance. By combining visible enforcement with financial pressure, Washington recalibrated the balance of power, ensuring that the impact of Operation Highway Sentinel would outlast any single arrest. As the dust settles on America's highways, the full arc of the operation comes into focus. It began with fatal crashes exposing hidden weaknesses, escalated into coordinated federal action unfolding in the heart of daily commerce, and expanded into a nationwide pressure campaign reshaping how authority moves across the road network. According to Reuters and the Associated Press, hundreds of drivers were detained across multiple states. But the deeper question now is what comes next, whether highways will remain active enforcement zones, how states will adapt their systems, and how far federal authority will extend when safety, funding, and control intersect. One thing is clear: America's highways are no longer just routes on a map. They are pressure points where policy, power, and public safety collide. And the outcome of Operation Highway Sentinel may define how enforcement works long after the flashing lights fade.